Emily had always known Jake was the one. From the moment they met at 16, growing up in the same neighborhood, playing in the park, and walking to school together, it all felt inevitable. Their friendship blossomed into something deeper over time, and by the time they graduated high school, they were inseparable. Emily always admired how determined Jake was. He knew from a young age that he wanted to be a pilot, and nothing could shake him from that dream. When he enrolled in aviation school, it was only natural for Emily to follow her heart and pursue a career as a flight attendant. They had their entire future mapped out: successful careers, adventures around the world, and someday, a family. But as the years passed, things began to change, slowly at first. They both found jobs at the same airline, but their schedules kept them apart. Emily often felt a distance growing between them, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly when it began. Maybe it was during Jake's longer flights, or the fact that they were always on different shifts, leaving little time to reconnect. One evening, after a long day of work, Emily sat across from Jake at their small dining table, going through travel brochures for their upcoming vacation. "Bali looks amazing," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I've been dreaming about this trip for months. Just imagine, the beaches, the sunsets. It'll be perfect." Jake barely looked up from his phone. "Yeah, sounds good," he muttered, his attention clearly elsewhere. Emily frowned, feeling the familiar pang of disappointment. "You don't seem that excited," she said softly, studying his face. "I thought this trip would be something we could really look forward to. You know, reconnect after everything." Jake sighed and finally set his phone down. "I am excited, Em. I've got a lot on my mind with work and all." But Emily wasn't convinced. Lately, Jake had been distant, distracted, even when they were together. She had noticed the subtle changes, how he barely laughed at her jokes anymore, how his kisses felt obligatory rather than affectionate. But she pushed those aside, telling herself that every long-term relationship had its ups and downs. They had been together for 9 years, after all, and they had built a life together. Emily was hopeful that the vacation would be a chance to reignite what had been slowly dimming between them. However, Jake's thoughts were elsewhere. He had already begun falling for someone else, Alyssa, a flight attendant who worked on his crew. She was spontaneous, carefree, and completely different from Emily. Jake wasn't sure how it had happened, but suddenly, every time he saw Alyssa, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. The excitement that had once been between him and Emily had now shifted to someone else, and as much as he tried to fight it, he couldn't deny it any longer. As the departure date for their vacation drew nearer, Jake knew he couldn't keep it a secret anymore. He had to tell Emily the truth, no matter how much it would hurt her. One evening, just a day before their planned departure, Emily sat on the couch flipping through the travel guide again, trying to decide what excursions they would do in Bali. Jake paced the room, his heart racing, knowing the moment had come. He had practiced what he was going to say 100 times, but now that he was here, standing in front of her, he couldn't find the words. "Emily, we need to talk," Jake said, his voice strained. She looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. Jake took a deep breath and sat beside her. I don't know how to say this, but I've met someone else." The room went silent. Emily's hands froze on the page of the guidebook as the words sank in. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It just happened," Jake continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I didn't plan for this, but I've fallen for someone else, and I don't think we can keep pretending like everything is fine between us." Emily felt as though the ground had disappeared from beneath her. Her mind raced as she struggled to make sense of what she was hearing. "We've been together for 9 years, Jake. We've been through everything together. How could you just throw that away?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Jake said, his own voice filled with guilt. "I care about you, Em. I always will. But something's changed. I can't go on like this." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "What about our trip? What about Bali? Were you even going to tell me before we got on that plane?" Jake's silence answered the question. He had hoped to delay the conversation, maybe even after the vacation, but now it was too late. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Emily stood up, her chest heaving with emotion. "Sorry? After 9 years, that's all you have to say?" She shook her head, the hurt and betrayal cutting deeper than she could have imagined. Go, just go, Jake. You've made your choice. Without another word, Jake left the apartment, leaving Emily alone with her shattered heart. She collapsed onto the couch, clutching the travel guide in her hands. The trip they had planned, the future they had imagined. It all felt like a distant dream now, one that had dissolved in an instant. As the tears finally began to fall, Emily realized that everything she thought was certain had vanished, and she didn't know how she would move forward from here. The days after Jake left were a blur for Emily. She spent most of her time curled up on the couch, the world outside feeling like a distant, unreachable place. She barely ate, barely slept, and most certainly didn't leave the apartment. The plane tickets to Bali sat on the kitchen counter, a cruel reminder of what could have been, mocking her each time she glanced in that direction. It was around noon on the third day when the doorbell rang, breaking the heavy silence that had taken over her apartment. Emily groaned, wondering who it could be. She wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone, and she definitely wasn't prepared for visitors. But the ringing continued, persistent, almost urgent. With a sigh, Emily pulled herself off the couch, wiped at her face, and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was a man she didn't recognize, but he looked equally stressed. His hair was slightly disheveled, and he was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt, as though he had just thrown it on in a hurry. "Hi, sorry to bother you," he began, his voice filled with exasperation. "But there's water leaking into my apartment downstairs, and I think it's coming from here." Emily blinked at him, her brain trying to process what he was saying. "Water?" she mumbled. "Yeah," he continued, gesturing toward the ceiling of his apartment below. "It's been dripping for the past hour. I came up to check because, well, it's getting bad." Emily's thoughts were slow and scattered. Water? Dripping? She hadn't even used the faucet all day. I don't know," she stammered, stepping aside to let him in. "I don't think there's anything wrong." The man stepped in, glancing around her kitchen, and moved straight toward the sink. "Do you mind if I check under here? It's probably a pipe issue," he said, crouching down to examine the area beneath the sink. Emily watched, feeling both numb and embarrassed. How could things possibly get worse? Her boyfriend had just left her, and now she was flooding her neighbor's apartment. Perfect. He quickly found the source of the problem, a small but steady leak from the pipe under the sink. "Ah, here's the issue," he said, tightening the valve. "It's a simple fix, but you might want to get a plumber in just to be safe." "Thanks," Emily muttered. "I had no idea this was happening." The man stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It's all right. These things happen. I'm Ryan, by the way. I live downstairs." "Emily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She offered a weak smile, feeling awkward about the whole situation. Ryan seemed to sense her discomfort and quickly changed his tone. "Listen, no harm done. Just wanted to make sure it didn't turn into a swimming pool down there." Emily couldn't bring herself to laugh at the joke. She nodded politely and muttered, "Thanks for fixing it." Ryan looked at her for a moment, his eyes softening as if he could see the sadness hanging over her like a dark cloud. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, sensing that something more than just a plumbing issue was weighing on her. Emily froze for a second, not expecting the question. She forced a small smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just dealing with some stuff." He nodded slowly, understanding that it wasn't his place to press further. "Well, if you need anything, I'm just downstairs. And a plumber." With that, he gave her a brief nod and left, leaving Emily standing alone in her kitchen, staring at the now dry floor. She hadn't even noticed how much she'd let go of everything until now. Her apartment was a mess, her heart was in pieces, and now she was unintentionally ruining someone else's day. The next day, Emily ventured outside for the first time in what felt like forever. She needed fresh air, or at least to clear her head. As she stepped out of her building and onto the sidewalk, she spotted Ryan across the street, walking his dog. The large golden retriever trotted happily beside him, its leash dangling loosely in his hand. Ryan waved when he saw her, crossing the street with the dog trotting eagerly beside him. "Hey, Emily," he called out. Before she could respond, the golden retriever darted toward her, wagging its tail excitedly. Emily froze, her heart racing as the dog jumped up on her, planting its paws on her legs. "Whoa! Down, Max!" Ryan rushed forward, tugging at the leash. "Sorry about that." He's friendly, just a little too enthusiastic sometimes. Emily took a step back, brushing off her jeans. I'm not really a dog person, she muttered, trying to hide her nervousness. Ryan gave her an apologetic smile. Max just likes to make friends. Sorry again. He means well. She forced a small laugh, but her discomfort was clear. It's fine, really. I just had a rough few days, and I guess I'm a little jumpy. Ryan nodded, his expression softening. If there's anything I can do to help, I'm around, and I promise Max will stay on his best behavior. Emily nodded, but the interaction was short, her mind still focused on everything else that had gone wrong in her life. Later that day, as she sat alone in her apartment, Emily found herself thinking about Ryan and his dog. She was grateful that he had helped her with the leak, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was unraveling faster than she could keep up with it. The breakup, the vacation she wasn't going on, the leak, it all felt like too much. But somehow, despite the chaos, Ryan had appeared at just the right moment. He had been kind, even if she wasn't in the mood for kindness. Maybe she'd see him again, she thought. But for now, she was just trying to get through each day. The days blurred together as Emily tried to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. She went back to work, throwing herself into long flights and brief layovers, hoping the constant movement would help her forget everything. But no matter how much she worked, the ache of Jake's betrayal lingered. It didn't help that every time she returned home, something seemed to go wrong. On one particularly exhausting weekend, Emily arrived home after a long-haul flight. All she wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep. The last thing she expected was to see Ryan standing outside her door, looking frustrated. "Hey," Ryan called out the moment he saw her, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "We've got the same problem again." Emily blinked, struggling to comprehend what he meant. "Problem?" she asked, clearly confused. "The leak," Ryan said, gesturing toward the ceiling of his apartment downstairs. "It's happening again. I've already tried tightening the valve, but it's not stopping this time." Emily groaned inwardly, feeling the weight of the situation pile onto her already exhausted mind. "Seriously? I just got home," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Ryan softened slightly at her tone. "I know it's a hassle, but the water's starting to seep through the ceiling again, and I just thought—" Okay, Emily interrupted, holding up her hands in surrender. "Let me check." She opened the door to her apartment and walked straight to the kitchen sink. Ryan followed her in, watching as she pulled open the cabinet underneath to inspect the pipe. Sure enough, there was a small puddle of water forming at the base of the pipe. Her heart sank. She had just had this issue fixed. Or so she thought. "I don't understand," Emily said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I called a plumber and had the whole thing replaced. How is this still happening?" Ryan crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Old pipes, I guess. These buildings have seen better days." Emily sat back on her heels, staring at the water with a sense of helplessness. This was just another problem added to the growing list of things in her life that seemed to be falling apart. "I don't have the energy for this," she muttered under her breath. Ryan took a step forward. "Look, I know it's a pain, but maybe we can figure it out together. Or I can recommend a different plumber. Someone who won't charge you an arm and a leg for something that's clearly not fixed." Emily hesitated, feeling a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. She didn't want to rely on anyone, especially not Ryan, who had already dealt with too much of her problems. But at the same time, she couldn't deny that she needed the help. "Thanks," she said, standing up and running a hand through her hair. "I'll call someone. Again." Ryan offered a small smile. "I get it. These things happen. It's just bad timing." "Yeah," Emily said with a heavy sigh, her mind still wrapped around the mess of her life. "Bad timing seems to be my theme lately." Ryan studied her for a moment, as if considering whether to say more. "You know," he began slowly, "you don't have to do everything on your own. If you ever need help with, well, anything, you can just ask." Emily blinked, surprised by the offer. There was something disarming about his sincerity, but she quickly brushed it off. "I appreciate it, but I'm fine." Ryan smiled, but there was a hint of understanding in his eyes. "All right, well, if you change your mind, you know where I am, and hopefully this leak won't keep you from getting some rest." With that, he turned to leave, but not before adding, "And if it's any consolation, you're handling all this way better than I would." Emily managed a weak smile as Ryan left, though her mind remained tangled in the chaos. Another leak. Another problem. She couldn't seem to catch a break. The next morning, Emily woke up earlier than usual, her mood already soured by the prospect of another day dealing with a broken faucet. She was running late, hurrying to get ready for work, when she stepped out of her apartment and nearly collided with Ryan again. He was walking toward his car, seemingly on his way to work as well. "Hey, morning!" Ryan called out, waving as he approached. "You headed out too?" Emily barely had time to answer before she heard the rumble of his car engine. She quickened her pace, but before she could reach the corner, she heard the sound of tires splashing through water. In an instant, a wave of cold, dirty water splashed up from the road and drenched her from head to toe. Ryan slammed on the brakes, horrified at what had just happened. "Oh, no, no, no!" he exclaimed, jumping out of his car. "Emily! I'm so sorry! I didn't see the puddle." Emily stood frozen, her clothes soaked and her hair dripping water. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment she couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. She had been running late already, and now this? Ryan rushed over, his face flushed with guilt. "I'm really sorry. I had no idea there was a puddle there. Can I offer you a ride to make up for it?" Emily stared at him, speechless. "A ride?" she repeated incredulously, her voice tight with frustration. "You've soaked me from head to toe, and you think a ride is going to fix this?" Ryan winced, realizing how absurd his offer sounded. "Right, yeah, that was stupid. I'm sorry." She took a deep breath, trying to calm the surge of emotions. "It's fine," she said finally, her voice strained. I'm having a really bad week." Ryan shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling awful. "I really didn't mean for this to happen. Let me at least help you out somehow. I'll pay for dry cleaning or something." Emily shook her head, still dripping wet. "No, Ryan, just let me get to work, okay? I don't have time for this." Ryan stepped back, clearly feeling out of his depth. "Okay, I get it. I'm really sorry, Emily. I didn't mean to make your day worse." Emily didn't say anything else, just hurried away, trying to ignore the feeling of her wet clothes clinging to her skin. This day couldn't possibly get any worse. After that incident, Emily did her best to avoid Ryan for a while. He was nice, sure, but every time they crossed paths, something went wrong. Between the leaks, the dog, and the puddle, it felt like Ryan was a magnet for chaos in her life. Still, there was a part of her that couldn't quite shake the fact that he seemed genuinely kind, despite all the unfortunate accidents. She saw him from time to time around the building, at the store, taking out the trash, or walking Max. But they didn't talk much. Every time their eyes met, there was a mixture of awkwardness and unspoken apology, but neither of them made the effort to strike up a conversation. At least not yet. Weeks had passed since Emily's disastrous run-in with Ryan and the puddle incident. Life had returned to a somewhat normal rhythm, but she was still haunted by the events of the past months. Jake's betrayal, the botched vacation, and the seemingly endless string of awkward encounters with her downstairs neighbor. Emily had thrown herself back into work, using the long hours in the air to escape from her messy personal life. But each time she returned to her apartment, the quiet reminder of Ryan lingered. They still crossed paths occasionally, exchanging awkward glances, but they hadn't spoken since that rainy morning. It was a Saturday afternoon when Emily found herself walking to the corner cafe for a much-needed break. She had no real plans for the day, so a quiet coffee and a good book seemed like the perfect way to unwind. As she turned the corner, she spotted Ryan sitting outside the cafe, casually reading a newspaper, Max lying lazily at his feet. The sight of him, so relaxed and at ease, took her by surprise. She considered walking by without acknowledging him, but before she could make her escape, Ryan looked up and their eyes met. "Emily," he called, his voice friendly but hesitant, as if he wasn't sure how she'd respond. He raised a hand in a small wave. "Hey!" Emily paused, debating whether to wave back or keep walking. She was still a little embarrassed about how things had gone between them, but she couldn't keep avoiding him forever. With a resigned sigh, she walked over. "Hey, Ryan," she replied, offering a tentative smile. "How's it going?" Ryan set down his newspaper and leaned back in his chair, clearly surprised she had stopped. "Good. Better now that Max isn't running into anyone?" "Ma," he said with a grin, gesturing to the dog lying quietly at his feet. "You want to join me?" Emily hesitated, glancing at the empty seat across from him. She had planned on some alone time, but something about his offer seemed genuine. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop being so guarded. Sure, why not? She said, taking the seat. I was just going to grab a coffee anyway. As she settled in, the awkwardness between them seemed to melt away. Ryan ordered her coffee, and they started chatting, at first about mundane things like work and the neighborhood. But gradually, the conversation deepened. So, Ryan said after a while, setting down his cup, I've been meaning to ask, how are you doing? I mean, really? Emily blinked, surprised by the question. Most people asked how she was in passing, never expecting more than a polite fine. But Ryan's expression was sincere, as if he genuinely cared about the answer. I'm doing okay, she said slowly, not quite sure how much to share. It's been a rough few months, to be honest. Ryan nodded, his gaze steady. Yeah, I kind of got that impression. I didn't want to pry before, but I could tell something was weighing on you. Emily smiled weakly. It's just life stuff, you know? My long-term boyfriend, well, ex-boyfriend now, broke up with me a few months ago, right before we were supposed to go on this big trip together. I think I've been trying to just move on, but it's been harder than I expected. Ryan's expression softened with empathy. I'm sorry to hear that. That sounds rough. It was, Emily admitted. But I'm getting through it, little by little. The hard part is just trying to let go of everything that I thought was certain. Ryan nodded thoughtfully. I get that. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it, sometimes in ways you never saw coming. There was a pause, and then Emily found herself laughing softly, and sometimes in the form of a neighbor with a leaky ceiling and a dog that scares the crap out of you. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. Hey, in my defense, Max is harmless. Enthusiastic, yes, but harmless. Emily smiled, feeling more at ease than she had in a long time. It was the first time in weeks that she didn't feel the weight of her sadness pressing down on her. And it was nice. From that day on, Emily and Ryan seemed to cross paths more frequently, and this time, it was no longer awkward or uncomfortable. Instead of trying to avoid each other, they found themselves sharing casual conversations whenever they bumped into each other. Sometimes it was in the hallway, other times at the cafe. Every time they talked, Emily felt a little lighter, a little less burdened by the mess that had once consumed her. One evening, after a particularly long workday, Emily returned to her apartment only to find Ryan sitting on the stairs with Max, holding two coffees. Hey, he greeted her with a smile. I thought you might need a pick-me-up after today. You looked pretty wiped when I saw you this morning. Emily blinked in surprise, then smiled. You noticed? Yeah, Ryan said, handing her the coffee. You looked like you could use it. Emily took the cup and sat down next to him on the stairs. Thanks. I needed this more than I realized. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, sipping their drinks and watching the sun dip below the horizon. There was something calming about the quiet presence of Ryan beside her, as if the simple act of sharing a coffee made all the day's stress fade away. You know, Emily began after a while, I never thought I'd be sitting here, drinking coffee with my neighbor who, a few weeks ago, I thought was the source of all my problems. Ryan laughed. Hey, I wasn't the one flooding your apartment. Emily grinned, bumping her shoulder lightly against his. No, but you weren't exactly helping. Fair enough, Ryan replied, still smiling. But I think we've come a long way since the puddle incident. I guess we have, Emily said softly, her smile lingering. She glanced at him, her heart warming at the easy connection they had developed. It was strange, unexpected even, but there was something comforting about Ryan's steady presence in her life. As the weeks passed, Emily realized she was looking forward to her encounters with Ryan more and more. He had become more than just a neighbor. He was someone she genuinely enjoyed spending time with. They started meeting more intentionally, grabbing coffee together, going for walks in the park with Max, and even catching a few movies. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, and before long, Emily found herself laughing and smiling in ways she hadn't in months. One evening, after they had just finished watching a movie at the local theater, Ryan turned to her as they walked home. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I really enjoy hanging out with you, Emily. Emily looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. I feel the same way, she admitted, her voice soft but sincere. Ryan smiled, his eyes warm as they locked onto hers. You're different from anyone I've ever met. I don't know how to explain it, but I'm really glad we've gotten to know each other. Emily's breath caught in her throat, but this time it wasn't out of frustration or sadness. It was something else entirely, something she hadn't expected, but welcomed all the same. Me too, she said, her heart fluttering as their steps slowed, the streetlights casting a warm glow around them. For the first time in months, Emily felt like she was finally ready to let go of the past and embrace something new. And maybe, just maybe Ryan was a part of that future. 6 months had passed since Emily and Ryan's first real conversation outside the cafe, and life had taken an unexpected but beautiful turn. What started as awkward encounters and small talk had blossomed into something far deeper. Emily couldn't quite pinpoint the exact moment she realized she had fallen for Ryan, but somewhere between their coffee dates, their walks with Max, and their late-night movie marathons, she knew her heart had healed, and it had made room for someone new. It wasn't just that Ryan made her feel good. He made her feel seen. He listened, truly listened, and always seemed to know what she needed, whether it was a joke to lift her spirits or a quiet moment to let her thoughts settle. He was everything she hadn't realized she was missing, and now that he was in her life, she couldn't imagine it without him. One evening, they sat together in Ryan's apartment. The warm glow of the setting sun filtered through the windows, casting a golden hue over the room. Max lay lazily at their feet, and the soft hum of music played in the background. Emily leaned into Ryan's side, her head resting on his shoulder, feeling the comfort of the moment. I never thought I'd end up here, Emily said softly, her voice thoughtful. Ryan turned to look at her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Here as in my apartment, or here as in us? Emily smiled, looking up at him. Both, I guess, but mostly us. A year ago, I would have never imagined myself sitting here, feeling this happy, feeling this at peace. Ryan's expression softened, his eyes filled with warmth. I know what you mean. Sometimes I still can't believe how things turned out. I didn't expect to meet someone like you when I moved in. Heck, I didn't even know my upstairs neighbor would be responsible for flooding my apartment twice. Emily laughed, nudging him playfully. Hey, that wasn't entirely my fault, Ryan chuckled, wrapping his arm around her. True, but still, I think the universe has a funny way of working things out. Those leaks led me to you, so I guess I should be grateful. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their words lingering in the air. Emily's mind wandered back to the days after her breakup with Jake. She had been so sure that her world was ending, that she would never find happiness again. But here she was, months later, wrapped in the arms of someone who made her feel more loved and appreciated than she had ever felt before. Do you ever think about the past? Emily asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Like where we've come from and how we got here. Ryan paused for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. Yeah, sometimes. I think about all the things that didn't go right and how those wrong turns brought me to the right place. Emily smiled at that. I used to be so angry about everything that happened with Jake, she admitted. I thought I'd wasted years of my life. But now, looking back, I don't see it that way. It wasn't wasted time. It just wasn't my time. Ryan turned her gently so that she was facing him, his eyes locking onto hers. I'm glad you feel that way, he said softly, because everything you've been through brought you here, and I don't want to imagine what life would be like if you hadn't walked into my life. Emily felt her heart swell at his words, the truth of them settling into her chest. I feel the same, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ryan leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Emily, I've been thinking a lot about something, he began, his tone more serious now. We've been through a lot together, and I know things didn't start out perfectly for either of us, but I know how I feel about you, and I know that I don't want to spend another day without you. Emily blinked, her heart racing at the sudden shift in the conversation. Ryan, what are you saying? Ryan stood up, taking her hand in his as he knelt down in front of her. Her breath caught in her throat as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily's eyes widened, her mind spinning as she tried to process what was happening. Emily, I love you, Ryan said, his voice steady and full of emotion. I've loved you for a while now, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Time seemed to stand still as Emily looked into his eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. Tears that she had never expected to shed again after everything she had been through. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, Ryan, I'll marry you. Ryan's face lit up with a smile so full of love that it made Emily's heart soar. He slid the ring onto her finger, and they both stood up, pulling each other into a tight embrace. It felt like the world had shifted, like everything had finally fallen into place. The months leading up to their wedding were a whirlwind of joy and excitement. Emily never thought she'd be planning a wedding, especially not so soon after the heartbreak she had endured. But everything about her relationship with Ryan felt right, natural, like they had been meant to find each other all along. The day of the wedding arrived, a small, intimate ceremony with only close friends and family. As Emily stood at the altar, looking into Ryan's eyes, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for Ryan, but for the journey that had led her to him. The heartbreak, the awkward beginnings, the missteps, they had all been part of the path that brought her to this moment. As they exchanged vows, Ryan's voice was filled with emotion. Emily, you've taught me what it means to love without fear, to embrace life's unexpected turns, and to find beauty in the chaos. I promise to stand by you, through the good times and the bad, for the rest of our lives. Tears slipped down Emily's cheeks as she responded. Ryan, you came into my life when everything felt broken, and you showed me that love can heal. You've been my strength, my joy, and my best friend. I promise to love you with everything I have, today and always. As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, Emily felt a wave of peace wash over her. This was her new beginning, a beginning that she never thought she would find, but one that felt more perfect than anything she could have ever imagined. Jake never married. His relationships remained fleeting, and he continued his womanizing ways. Emily, on the other hand, had found something real, something lasting. She and Ryan built a life together, filled with love, laughter, and soon enough, the pitter-patter of tiny feet. 2 sons, as it turned out. Looking back, Emily realized that everything had happened exactly as it was meant to. Jake was her past, a chapter in her life that had taught her lessons. But Ryan was her future. Together, they were building something beautiful. And for the first time in a long time, Emily knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.